Hello, this is a video on multiplying fractions, just kind of the introduction, more of a big picture in case you're not in class, or if you just wanted to review this, you could always come to this video. But basically, we're going to be multiplying fractions, whole numbers, and mixed numbers, which can seem a little bit confusing at first, but I guess the first thing that we need to realize is that when we're multiplying a fraction times a fraction, that's what we're going to be starting with. Basically, any number can be a fraction if you write it over 1. So it's the same as, it's not really any different than multiplying whole numbers. So if I do whole number times whole number, which we all know how to do. So when let's say it's 2 times 2. Well, if we wanted to, we know that that's 4. If we wanted to make this a fraction times a fraction, you just put it over 1, which ends up being 1. The way that multiplying fractions works is you multiply the numerators, which are the two top numbers, straight across. 2 times 2, and it gives you 4. So you keep it in the numerator. Then you multiply the denominators. 1 times 1 is 1, and you write that answer in the denominator of your answer. So the product will be the same thing as multiplying the numerators and writing it where the numerator is, and multiplying the denominators, whatever that product is, you write it in the denominator, and that gives you the product of 2 times 2, which is 4 over 1, which is still 4. Get rid of this. So multiplying fractions isn't any different than what we did with the whole numbers. Let's say it was 1/2 times 1/2. We do the same thing, except the numbers are flipped, where the ones are on the top. So 1 times 1 gives you a 1 for your numerator of your product, and 2 times 2 gives you 4. So it looks like 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/4. But what does that really mean? And that's what we're going to be focusing on, is maybe we can multiply fractions here. Do we know what multiplying fractions means? With whole numbers, when you're multiplying, this is saying two groups of 2. Like, here's a group of 2 things. There's a group of 2 squares. Here's a group of 2 squares. So it's 2 groups of 2, the number of groups and how many are in each group. That's the same concept with fractions. It's just the amount that is in each group is going to be a half. And how many groups you're going to have is a half of a group. So if you had a half of a group that each group had a half in it, you would have a fourth. Another way to think about that can be a little bit confusing is if you want to find out what 2 times something is, like let's say 20, you had $20 and then you got 2 times as much, you multiply it by 2. If you want to know what half of that is, you multiply it by a half. So 20 times a half would be half of 20. And 20 times 2 would be twice as much as 20. So 20 times 2 is 40, 20 times a half. So if we wanted to multiply these like they were fractions, I would write this as 20 over 1, multiply the two top numbers here, which is 20 times 1, which gives me 20, and then 1 times 2, which would be 2. So it says I have 20 halves, which that can be simplified. 20 halves equals 10 wholes. So it looks like half of 20 is 10, and we know that that is true. Half of 20 is 10, and 2 times 20 is 40. So here, this is the amount that we're splitting in half. So here, 1/2, if we take a half of something and we split that half in half, now that half of a half is a fourth. So really this is saying what's half of a half, or top one is saying what's 2 times 2 wholes, or if it were a whole number times 2. This is saying you could look at it as what's 2 groups of 1/2, or what's a half of a group of 2. You'll get the same thing. We know that half of 2 is 1. But if you also had 2 halves, here's a half, here's a half, you have 1 whole. Or if you look at it this way and do half of 2, here's 2 whole things, half of it is 1 whole. So you can look at it either way. Since multiplication, the order can be switched around. You can multiply it 1/2 times 2 or 2 times 1/2 and still get the same answer here. But really, the big idea is, do you know how to multiply fractions? And that is, to multiply fractions, you multiply the numerators and you multiply the denominators, and you write your answer in the corresponding places. So the numerator stays in the numerator, the denominator stays in the denominator. One common mistake is to do this. Let's say it was 2/3 times 1/4. Kind of a tricky one. We do not cross multiply. So that is not the way to multiply fractions. That is a different situation that you would use that. Here we multiply straight across. It's actually pretty simple. I think that adding fractions is much harder to do than multiplying fractions. For example, we have 1/3 times 1/2. We multiply the top, you get 1. You multiply the bottom, you get 6. So 1/6 is the answer. But if I wanted to add these together, here's where adding is a little bit trickier than multiplying. You can't add 1/2 and 1/3 together because they don't have like denominators. So we need to change these, convert them, then add them once they have like denominators. Here, they don't need like denominators. You just multiply. So I actually prefer multiplying fractions rather than adding them. So in this example over here, here's one right out of the book. It says, work with a partner. A park has a playground that is 3/4 of its width and 4/5 of its length. What fraction of the park is covered by the playground? Okay, so let's draw this out. Let's say, I don't know if this is going to be exactly to scale, but it'll be close. Say we have it doesn't say what shape it is. We have a park. That's really all that's important. And we know that 3/4 of its width, so we'll say that this is the width and this is the length, that 3/4 of the width has the playground. So if here's a half, here's 3/4, here's 1/4. So this part is going to be the playground, this part here. But how much of the length? It's 4/5. So let's divide this into fifths. About fifths. So it looks like it would go all the way over to here, where like 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, 4/5 would be here. Okay. Well, how much of the park is taken up by the playground is what they want to know. It's not all of it. It's just a fraction of it. But what fraction? Well, since we have these divided up here into fourths and fifths, if I were to just continue these out, and we know that this part is the park. And then I'll just continue these lines this way. Now is it easier to tell what fraction of the park is covered by the playground? Now we can see how many parts there are and how many parts are filled in. I guess this would be 4 by 3, so there'd be 12 pieces colored in, and there's 5 across and 4 down, so this is out of 20 total. So if we have 12 out of 20 total, then what fraction is that? It's 12/20ths of the park. That can also be simplified since they're both even down to 6/10, and it can still be simplified down to 3/5. So it looks like 3/5 of this park is covered by the playground. Just to try to make this, because it's hard to see 3/5 the way that it's drawn now. But if I erased these and I moved them to the bottom, so I erase 3, I add 3, it is 3/5. This part is 3/5 of the park. It's not the right dimensions, but I just moved the pieces so we can see that it is, in fact, 3/5 of the park. You could use this. I mean, the area model does help you. It doesn't necessarily have to be an area. Sometimes you might have, let's say you had a sandwich and there was half of a sandwich. Let's say I'm going to draw a square sandwich or rectangle sandwich. This is a sandwich. And let's say you had half of it. So this half is not there. The only half that you have is here. You have half of it. And let's say you wanted to split that between your 4 friends. Well, you'd have to split this half into 4 pieces. How much would each person get? Well, what you want to know is what's 1/4 of a half. And if you want to know what a fraction of a fraction is, you multiply them. And we multiply the tops, the numerators. We multiply the bottom 2 numbers, the denominators. We get the answer, which is 1/8, which in this picture, which that part of the sandwich isn't there, it's still 4/8 for the half that isn't there, 4/8 for the half that is there, and 1/8 would be if you divided that half into fourths. You could do lengths. It could be a piece of string. Let's say this piece of string is, let's make this one a little bit tricky. Let's say we have a piece of string that is 3¼ feet long. And you want to split this piece of string between, let's say, 3 of your friends. How much would each person get if it was cut right in half? Or not in half, but in threes, in thirds. We want to know what 1/3 of 3¼ is. How do you find out what a 1/3 of 3¼ is? Well, 3¼ if we want to find what 1/3 of it is, we multiply it by 1/3. Or another way is you could divide by 3. You could find 1/3 that way. But we'll stick with multiplying here. We have a mixed number, though. We don't have a fraction, so we can't multiply fractions when there's a mixed number. But can we change this to an improper fraction? 3 wholes, is, well, 1 whole is 4/4. So 3 of them would be 4/4, 4/4, and 4/4. So it would be 12/4 if you had 3 wholes, and then an extra fourth, so we'd have 13/4. And then if we multiply that by 1/3, we get 13 on the top, 12 on the bottom. We get 13/12, which is the same as 1 whole and 1 extra 12th here. So 1 and a 12th would be, if these were all equal, 1 and a 12th feet would be each part if you wanted to divide this string into 3 equal parts. All right, so now we have a good introduction on how to multiply fractions, whole numbers times fractions, mixed numbers times fractions, fractions times fractions. There's a lot of combinations here, but it really boils down to multiplying fractions times fractions. And we're going to get a lot more practice with what this means and how you can use this, because it is really important. It's actually probably one of the most important skills to have, is understanding how to work with fractions like you can work with whole numbers, to be able to add, subtract, multiply, and divide them. All right, well, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask in class, and I will see you soon.